These are creatures that weigh less than a handful of coins, yet they can detect a tornado from 1,000 kilometers away, evacuate before the first weather alert hits your phone, and in some cases, deliberately fly straight into the most violent storms on the planet. This is where birds really go during a storm, and it's not what you think. We tend to imagine birds as fragile things, delicate bones, hollow and light, built for calm skies and gentle breezes. So when a hurricane barrels toward the coast or a supercell thunderstorm tears across the Midwest, our natural assumption is that birds are victims, helpless, at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. But the science tells a completely different story. Birds aren't just surviving storms. Some of them are outsmarting them. Others are exploiting them. And a few are doing something so bizarre that when researchers first saw the data, they nearly fell off their chairs. Let's start with how birds even know a storm is coming, because this alone will change the way you look at the sparrow on your windowsill. Birds possess biological equipment that makes our best weather apps look primitive. Deep within their beaks and behind their eyes, birds carry specialized cells containing magnetite, a naturally magnetic mineral. These cells allow them to detect subtle shifts in electromagnetic patterns in the atmosphere. Before a major storm, atmospheric electromagnetic conditions change due to ionization and distant lightning activity. Birds pick up on these shifts the way you might notice a change in temperature, except they're sensing something invisible, something we need expensive instruments to measure. But that's only one layer of their detection system. Birds can also sense changes in barometric pressure through specialized receptors. A drop in air pressure signals an approaching storm system, and birds register it long before the clouds even begin to darken. This is why birdwatchers have noticed for centuries that feeders go quiet before bad weather rolls in. The birds aren't hiding yet. They're preparing. And then there's infrasound. This is where things get truly remarkable. Extreme weather events like cyclones and tornadic supercells produce infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, that can travel more than 1,000 kilometers from the source. Which brings us to one of the most extraordinary wildlife studies of the past decade, the golden-winged warbler story. In May of 2013, researcher Henry Strebe, an ecologist at UC Berkeley, and his colleague Gunnar Kramer, a population ecologist at the University of Minnesota, fitted 20 male golden-winged warblers with tiny light-level geolocators at a breeding site in Tennessee's Cumberland Mountains. These birds weigh about 9 grams. That's roughly the weight of 4 dimes stacked together. The geolocators were meant to track their regular migration patterns, nothing more. Fast forward to late April 2014. The warblers had just completed a grueling 5,000-kilometer spring migration from eastern Colombia back to their breeding territories in Tennessee. They arrived between April 13th and April 27th. They were settling in, business as usual. And then, on April 27th, something strange happened. The birds vanished. 1 to 2 days before a massive supercell storm system swept through the region, the warblers abandoned their breeding grounds. They didn't hunker down. They didn't find a thicket to hide in. They left. They flew south. Some stopped along the Florida Panhandle. One bird kept going all the way to Cuba. When the storm hit on April 28th, it was catastrophic. The system spawned 84 confirmed tornadoes across the Midwest and killed at least 35 people. And the warblers were already gone. Several days later, after the storms passed, the birds flew back to Tennessee. Round trip, some of them had covered more than 900 miles, 1,500 kilometers, a journey they undertook voluntarily, on top of the 5,000-kilometer migration they had just completed. We were completely blown away by this behavior, Kramer said. It shows that the birds can do more than we give them credit for. Strebe suspects the cue was infrasound. At the same time that meteorologists on the Weather Channel were telling us this storm was headed in our direction, he explained, the birds were apparently already packing their bags and evacuating the area. Radar studies have since confirmed this pattern on a larger scale, showing large flocks of birds taking flight 24 to 48 hours before a hurricane makes landfall. They're not reacting, they're anticipating. So if some birds flee, what do the rest do? This is where the three great storm strategies come into play, and each one is a masterwork of adaptation. The first strategy is evacuation migration, exactly what the warblers demonstrated. Larger, stronger flyers like hawks, herons, and egrets excel at this. They don't fly away randomly. Research shows birds typically fly perpendicular to a hurricane's trajectory, cutting across its path to exit the danger zone as efficiently as possible. It's the aerodynamic equivalent of stepping sideways out of the way of an oncoming train, rather than trying to outrun it. The second strategy is sheltering, and this is what most smaller birds do. Up to 90% of songbirds shelter in dense vegetation during severe weather, tucking themselves deep into thickets, hedgerows, tree cavities, and even the structural crevices of buildings. Their preparation begins before the storm arrives. Studies show birds can increase their caloric intake by 30% in the hours before severe weather, essentially binge eating to build up energy reserves for what could be an extended period without food. Their feathers provide remarkable insulation and waterproofing. Duck feathers, for example, show water contact angles between 140 and 150 degrees, making them incredibly hydrophobic. And here's a detail that's easy to overlook, but genuinely astonishing. Birds can lock their grip. The avian foot has a locking tendon mechanism that automatically tightens their toes around a branch when they sit. It's called the perching reflex, and it works passively, without any muscular effort. This means a bird can cling to a violently swaying branch in hurricane-force winds without consciously gripping. They can even sleep through it. Their feet are literally engineered for storms, but it's the third strategy that nobody expected: flying into the storm. In July of 2024, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution published a groundbreaking study in the journal Current Biology that upended decades of assumptions about how seabirds deal with tropical cyclones. The subject was the Desertas petrel, a pigeon-sized seabird so rare that its only known breeding colony, on Bugio Island in the Madeira archipelago, contains fewer than 200 nesting pairs. Researchers led by Francesco Ventura tracked 33 breeding petrels using data loggers during the breeding seasons of 2015 through 2017 and 2019. They analyzed 43 individual flights and discovered something no one had seen before. Nearly half the tracked flights brought birds within 200 kilometers of the eye of a tropical cyclone, where they encountered winds up to 86 kilometers per hour and ocean waves over 6 feet high. And here's the part that made the researchers nearly fall off their chairs. 1/3 of the tracked petrels didn't avoid the cyclone, didn't circle around it, and didn't get trapped in the eye. They followed it for days, covering thousands of kilometers. Initial studies suggested that seabirds either circumnavigate cyclones or seek refuge in the calm eye of the storm, Ventura explained. However, the Desertas petrels we tracked did neither. Instead, 1/3 of them followed the cyclone for days, covering thousands of kilometers. When we saw the data, we nearly fell off our chairs. This is the first time we have observed this behavior. Why would any animal deliberately chase a hurricane? The answer lies beneath the waves. Desertas petrels feed on small fish, squid, and crustaceans that normally live at depths of 600 to 3,000 feet, far too deep for these surface-feeding birds to reach. But tropical cyclones churn the ocean violently, disrupting thermal layers and pushing deep-water prey toward the surface. The storms create a moving feast. The petrels had figured out that the most dangerous place in the ocean was also the most productive restaurant. Not all birds are so lucky, though. And this brings us to the darker side of this story. When birds get pulled into a hurricane and reach the calm eye at the center, they're trapped. The eye might be serene, but it's surrounded by a wall of wind so violent that no bird can fly through it. They're stuck, forced to travel with the storm wherever it goes. If the hurricane is over open ocean, there's nowhere to land, nowhere to rest. A study led by Matthew Van Den Broeke at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln analyzed 33 hurricanes between 2011 and 2020 and found a direct correlation. The greater the wind speed, the more birds were trapped inside the eye. The more severe the hurricane, the more daunting the prospect of trying to escape the relative safety of the eye, even if staying meant spending thousands of miles and a week airborne. During Hurricane Helene in September 2024, weather radar captured a dense mass within the eye of the storm over Florida. Experts quickly realized it was a flock of birds, caught and carried. A month later, during Hurricane Milton, the National Hurricane Center observed the same phenomenon, a flock of birds visible on radar traveling inside the eye. And then there are the birds that get displaced entirely. In August of 2023, Hurricane Idalia pushed an estimated 150 American flamingos deep into the eastern United States. On September 23rd, 5 flamingos were spotted in Port Washington, Wisconsin. Ryan Brady, a conservation biologist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, confirmed it was the first known record of a wild American flamingo in the state's history. Having them on our beaches is not something really that's been seen in more than 100 years, said Julie Raithmel, director of Audubon, Florida. One of the most famous displacement cases happened during Hurricane Michael in 2018, when a Category 5 storm made landfall near Panama City, Florida. After the storm, a single flamingo, eventually dubbed Pinky, was spotted in a wildlife refuge south of Tallahassee. Pinky was seen there for years afterward, a living souvenir of a catastrophic storm. After Hurricane Helene, sooty terns, birds native to the Caribbean, were found more than 1,600 kilometers away in Indiana. But displacement is survivable. What's harder to survive is starvation, and this is where the story takes its most troubling turn. Between December 2013 and February 2014, a series of relentless storms hammered the North Atlantic. What followed was one of the worst seabird mass mortality events in recorded history. Along the European coastlines, 54,982 wrecked birds were recorded. 94% of them were dead. Nearly 80% were found on the French coast, and the most impacted species was the Atlantic puffin, accounting for over half of all casualties. The storms hadn't killed them directly. The sustained violent weather had prevented the birds from feeding for so long that they starved. This phenomenon is known as a wreck. And while wrecks are a natural occurrence, they're getting worse. In the first months of 2026, it happened again. Thousands of dead and dying seabirds washed up along the Atlantic coasts of Western Europe. Over 20,000 were found in France alone. More than 10,000 dead puffins have been recorded so far. Julia Parrish, a seabird ecologist at the University of Washington, called it massive, unprecedented, estimating total deaths between 50,000 and 100,000. One of the victims was a 34-year-old puffin. Seabirds live long lives and breed only once a year, which means their populations depend on adults surviving year after year. When a single event kills tens of thousands of breeding-age birds, the demographic damage can take decades to recover from, if recovery happens at all. Seabirds are in trouble, said Halvard Strum, head of section and senior scientist at the Norwegian Polar Institute. Of almost 11,000 species, seabirds are the most threatened bird species on the planet. Across the United Kingdom, 62% of seabird species are in decline. In Scotland, the country's seabird stronghold, the decline reaches 70%. Climate change is compounding every threat. Storms are becoming more powerful. Prey species are shifting in distribution and abundance. Breeding seasons are being disrupted by extreme weather events. And seabirds are simultaneously facing unsustainable fishing practices, invasive predators, and poorly sited offshore wind farms. The 1983 die-off in the North Sea, when 57,000 guillemots, razorbills, puffins, and other seabirds washed up on British coasts, was considered the worst on record at the time. We may be surpassing it. So where do birds go during a storm? The answer is everywhere and nowhere simple. Some flee, reading atmospheric signals we can barely detect with our best technology, evacuating with a precision that puts our emergency response systems to shame. Some shelter, locking their feet to branches, fluffing their waterproof feathers, and waiting it out on reserves of fat they stockpiled hours earlier. Some get trapped, carried inside hurricane eyes across hundreds of miles of open ocean with no way out. Some get displaced, flamingos in Wisconsin, terns in Indiana, vagrants in places they were never meant to be. Some chase the storm itself, riding in the wake of cyclones to feast on prey churned up from the deep. And some, too many, don't make it at all. The next time a storm rolls through and the birds disappear from your yard, know this: they haven't simply vanished. They're executing survival strategies refined over millions of years of evolution, strategies so sophisticated that we're only just beginning to understand them. The silence before a storm isn't emptiness, it's intelligence. And if the birds at your feeder go quiet on a sunny afternoon, you might want to check the forecast, because they already have. And studies show up to 70% more birds will be at that feeder after the storm passes. They'll be back, hungry, tired, and alive, because they knew what was coming before anyone else did.